Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling a word that has absolutely shaped history and still sparks intense debate: communism. But what if the picture most of us have in our heads is, well, completely different from the original idea? Think about it. When you hear communism, what images pop into your head? For a lot of us, it's things like one-party dictatorships, total state control, the individual being crushed by the collective, a story we tend to associate with places like the old Soviet Union or Mao's China. And yeah, that's pretty much the standard picture, right? A top-down society, a state-planned economy. But here's the wild part. This popular understanding is dramatically different from what the theory's most famous thinkers actually described. In fact, Karl Marx himself once famously said, "If anything is certain, it is that I myself am not a Marxist." Wow, that hints at a huge gap between the original theory and everything that came later. It really makes you wonder, if the man himself rejected that label, what on earth did he actually envision? All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start with that common picture, then we'll unfold the original idea, take a look at its 6 core components, explore that famous slogan, and finally, we'll put the vision right up against the historical reality. So first up, let's just face it head on, that common picture. In the 20th century, the word communism became powerfully, and let's be honest, often very negatively charged. For so many, the word has become shorthand for utopian dreams that went horribly, tragically wrong. We're talking about famines, prison camps, mass executions, just a list of absolute nightmares that often get laid directly at the feet of Karl Marx. Okay, so to really get to the bottom of the original idea, we have to kind of separate the thinkers from the fan club he never chose and see where this concept actually came from in the first place. Because you see, Marx didn't just invent communism out of thin air. The idea of collective ownership had been kicking around for centuries, from Christian radicals way back in the 1600s to French authors in the late 1700s. It was only in the 1840s that Marx picked up. Now, he never actually wrote down a single neat blueprint, but we can piece it together from his work. And when you do piece together his scattered remarks, a surprisingly coherent vision emerges, and it's built on 6 main components. Okay, so here they are. First, freedom as individual self-direction. Second, no states or classes. Third, collective ownership, but by the producers themselves. Fourth, participatory planning instead of markets. Fifth, that famous idea of distribution according to need. And finally, no, 6, an end to the rigid division of labor. Let's zoom in on a couple of these to really get what they mean. Let's start with freedom. For Marx, this wasn't just about being left alone to do your thing. It was this active, conscious ability to direct your own life and your own work, what he called self-activity. Think of it like this: an artist who's drawing just for the pure joy and expression of it. They're free. But an artist who is forced to draw by a micromanaging parent, the physical action is the same, but the freedom, that self-direction, is totally gone. That's the core of what he was getting at. Okay, another crucial point: ownership. There's this huge myth that communism means you don't even own your toothbrush. But the theory makes a really key distinction. It was never about getting rid of your personal belongings. It's about getting rid of the private ownership of productive things, like factories or huge plots of land, that can be used to exploit other people's labor. And that leads us right to the logic of distribution, and what is maybe one of the most famous and misunderstood slogans in all of political history. See, Marx didn't think society could just flip a switch overnight. He saw a transition. First, there'd be a lower phase that still has echoes of capitalism, where what you get is based on how much you work, maybe using something like labor vouchers. But only later, in a higher phase, after old ways of thinking fade away, could society move to a system where things are distributed based entirely on need. So, what does needs actually mean here? Well, it's not just about survival stuff, like food and water. It refers to the whole spectrum of human desires, from basic shelter to psychological needs like creating art or, hey, even just wanting to play a video game. The idea is you satisfy the basic necessities first, which then frees everyone up to let these other needs and desires really flourish. Okay, so now we've got a much clearer picture of the theory, right? And that lets us go back to the 20th century and see how the historical reality actually stacks up against that vision. And when you put them side by side, the gap between the theory and the practice is, well, it's massive. Marx's vision was for a stateless society run by producers themselves. The reality in the so-called communist states was an all-powerful centralized state run by a party dictatorship. In almost every key way, they were total opposites. So by the standards that Marx himself wrote about, these regimes never actually achieved communism. They claimed they were in a transitional socialist phase, but for a lot of analysts, they really just ended up being a transition from one form of capitalism back to another. And what's really fascinating is that this outcome wasn't some huge surprise to everyone. Decades before the Russian Revolution, anarchist thinkers were already predicting that if you use a centralized authoritarian state as your method, you could never achieve the free, liberating goal of communism. For them, the 20th century didn't prove communism failed. It proved that their critique was right all along. So if you take away just one thing from all of this, let it be this critical distinction. On one side, you have a political and economic theory, and on the other, you have the historical states that flew its banner but built something fundamentally different. Getting a handle on that huge gap between the theory and the practice is really the most important piece of the entire puzzle. Now, understanding this distinction doesn't really give us any easy answers. Instead, it leaves us with a really big provocative question. If the methods you use completely shape the results you get, what does it actually take to build that free and equal world that so many different movements have been fighting for? That's definitely something we're thinking about.